throw eggs at your car. I've heard of, someone throwing fireworks through people's letterboxes.
Wow, that's dangerous.
Because somebody ran out of candy, so I guess they didn't like it, and threw fireworks through their letterboxes.
It's kind of interesting, and I've noticed too that it's more about sort of like fancy dress parties. And than it is trick or treating there, right? So, and right. If fancy dress for folks who are listening, that is essentially costuming. If you say in the UK it's fancy dress, it doesn't mean you're putting a tuxedo on or you're actually putting on a costume, right? So. Yeah.
Thanks for speaking my language, Seeker. I really appreciate it.
My entire family, like I said, my grandmother, my mother, everyone were born there, right? So it's just because I don't have the accent doesn't mean I don't know the customs.
but here in America, it's taken much more seriously, I believe. I think, just personally.
Well, I think it took on an entire entity of its own, and that's something like let's talk about that, right? Because we talk about how we remember things, but the interesting thing is too the way that this holiday, and technically it isn't really a holiday, it's a celebration or acknowledgement, I guess, is really a better way of talking about it. We don't get the day off. We don't get it. It really is just celebrating. And
they have been asking for it to be on Saturdays. But, parents have been saying, look, it's in the middle of the week. We can't get our kids out to trick or treat, and they really want to. So there was a big campaign going around, I guess, where people could sign the change.org, where they were trying to get Halloween to be on Saturday, so that it made, it was a lot safer and people could drink, and it was a weekend.
Right. So let's look at really historically then. Who would have celebrated this, and why? Why do they celebrate this, right? I mean, we kind of know the word Samhain, right, or Samhain and Samhain. But what does it mean, and where did it sort of get its origins? I mean, I know that everybody goes back to Ireland with this, and Scotland and Manx and sort of, that general area. But for most part, it really was observed by the Celts in general, right? So no matter where the Celts were at the time, they may have been Galatians, etc. It's taken on this kind of new old world thing with neo-pagans and Wiccans and things like that too, right? Going back. But in truth, it's really a kind of mid-season harvest or end of harvest season, right? That kind of falls.
The old traditions of what we call Halloween.
Right.
It marked the end of the harvesting season and the beginning of winter.
Yeah, and because we're moving into that darker half of the year. So traditionally, this was a time to eat and have a feast and enjoy and light a fire and celebrate sort of the bounty of the harvest, but also to, create food storage and all of these things moving into, the cold winter months or the harshest times of year. And the fire really symbolized that. And I want to throw this out to you guys because I just learned something the other day that I thought maybe I didn't know. And then I thought, I think I know this. But then I went back and looked at some notes many, many years ago and realized that I indeed learned it but had forgotten it. The word bonfire. Do you know where the word bonfire comes from?
No, I don't.
Can't say that I do, no.
Interestingly enough, bonfire actually started out, it's Old English, not quite Anglo-Saxon, so it's after that, but just in between that period between Anglo-Saxon and Old English language, was bone fire, was the burning of the bones.
I didn't know that. See, I associate bonfires with Guy Fawkes Night. And,
Yeah.
In England.
Yes.
Yeah.
But again, at this time of the year,
not really with Halloween.
Having a big, well, and it wasn't just, about Halloween. That's what I'm saying. Just the general term bonfire had to do with the burning of bones. So often the cremation of bodies, right? So it was that huge fire that was needed, the heat to burn the body and burn those bones to ash. So bonfire, bon, is the old English word for bone. So interesting. And like I said, I kind of thought I knew it and hadn't heard it for a long time. And then I heard it and I was like, oh,
I say every session I say every show because I learn something new. And I do.
Well, and I relearned something that clearly I had learned many, many years ago in some of my anthropology programming, but had completely forgotten and just, relearned it again when I heard it the other day. So that's an interesting thing. So looking at, again, this time of year, generally celebrated between October 31st and November 1st on what we now know as the Gregorian calendar, right? Mm-hmm. In the ancient times, going back to the Iron Age and the Bronze Age, they were actually celebrating as well, just in a different way. But at that time, of course, they didn't really look at the date per se, right? It wasn't like, oh, today's October 31st, we have to, right? It was based on their changing of the season, their harvest, their time of the year, which generally falls around this time, right? But it carried over for more than a day. So here it's like Halloween, yay, it's done. It's October 31st and it's over. But in historically, it was over several days, right? And then Christianity came into it, and it became something slightly different. And that was something off the top of the show that I had mentioned, is that some people believe that Halloween itself is more of a Christian belief as opposed to Samhain and how that was celebrated. Right. So, well, we will discuss this, and you will understand perhaps how some people believe this to be what it is, and I can completely understand it. Right. So,
in certain cultures, I know that, as you say, it's more than just October 31st. That it extends into November 1st. And even specifically the what I believe is the Mexican culture, on November 2nd is what they call the Day of the Dead. And they kind of incorporate that entire Halloween, All Saints Day stuff all merged together.
Right. And you have to remember, too, with them that originally in their cultures, their Aztec, the Mayan, those people, that they had their own holidays or their own celebrations around, again, that shift in the season, because they're on a latitude, they're essentially just above the equator. So the seasons did have a slight, of course, it's not like here where we're, going from spring to summer to winter, but there were still changes in the seasons to a degree, and what food sources were available, and the way the weather patterns changed, etc. So their celebration really brings in some of their the old Aztec, the old Mayan, but also, of course, because of the Spanish, a lot of Catholicism, right? So that's where a lot of that comes from. Now, interestingly enough, just looking at some of the information that I was going through earlier, again, it kind of goes back to the Celts, right? But there's sort of a real mishmash there, because, again, we have to look at what was pre-Christian influence, and it's really difficult to do that through written manuscripts, because Ireland, Scotland, and even England at that time, Britain, there wasn't any real written language. So we don't really know how they celebrated per se. What we do know is by looking historically at sites, right? So we're looking at perhaps celebration sites or specific spiritual locations, and we look at a number of different things in the way buildings were erected, and was it this week? Yeah, just this week, I believe it was. Actually, no, it was last week. I was lucky enough to be invited to watch and listen to an archaeologist out of Scotland, Glasgow, who was speaking on wheelhouses. And these wheelhouses really have a life of their own only in the Outer Hebrides and the Shetland Islands. So they don't exist anywhere else. And they possibly go back to Neolithic, to Bronze. They're most definitely Iron Age. And a lot of them were used right up until the Victorian era. Predominantly, they were dwellings. And if you're at all familiar with the Outer Hebrides, or if you're not, it's a very kind of rocky terrain. Once upon a time, there were some trees, but those trees were all cut down for the most part for building places to live. So, and it's kind of a strange landscape there because they have the shorelines, of course, because they are islands. But on the eastern side of the island is where the most fertile land is, on the west side of the island, and on the east side is more rocky. So it's a very, there's not a lot of growing there. There's not a lot of agricultural. There's a lot of peat harvesting there and things like that. So these houses were built mostly from rocks. And they were round structures, which is why they're called wheelhouses, but it's how they were built. Inside, they have piers. So they have these sectioned piers that go around, and these piers don't connect to the outside wall, which is, we're still trying to figure that out as archaeologists and people studying this. Right. But they were used to hold up the wooden beams for the circular round roofs. So they're really quite a very unique style. Look them up online. There, like I said, there's really no other buildings like this anywhere. There's round houses in the UK. You hear about Roman round houses and things like that, but not built in this pattern. They're very unique. But interestingly enough, some of those, we were talking about some of those locations and some of the things there, and this sort of came into play, was the directions of the doors. The doorways are all facing east for the most part. There's, I believe, 2 wheelhouses where the doors did not face east. And so this is going back to the Iron Age culture. And so they were, why were they having their doors facing east, right? So there's a number of things, much like Stonehenge and many other, you've got that east-west alignment. The sun comes up, it shines the light in. There's no windows in these wheelhouses, so the only light you would have received would have been from the sun entering through that door. But also, too, there's the Eastern Passage and a lot of things with death that are associated with the facings of the directions. So this got us chatting a little bit about, the celebrations of Samhain and also Beltane and a number of other celebrations that went on in these vicinities, and how even building their homes were greatly influenced by, the passage of light and death and all of these different things. So really interesting. And much the same with Samhain, this celebration, we look at now, it's changed a little bit, right? Because back then it was a Celtic festival that was really just around the fall harvest. There's nothing to indicate that they were celebrating any dead or anything like that, right? So the connotations of that came later on with Christianity.